Hey, so hopefully if you're watching this, you've come from my first video. This is a bit more in depth on how to actually look at exploring and actually practicing cognitive behavioral therapy yourself. First of all, just a disclaimer. This is in no way a replacement for actual therapy. If you need help for issues that you are finding just too compounding on your life, it's really important to go see somebody because while I think there are a lot of things that we can do ourselves, I think sometimes we do need external help, and a professional will help you do that. There have been many times in my life that I have practiced things like cognitive behavioral therapy with myself, but still needed to go to a psychologist, and I am educated in the field of psychology myself. So, not to say that I, would be as qualified to know everything, but even so, even with a knowledge of the therapies that I know that they'll use, I still went myself. I think there's a real value to being able to talk to someone through your problems. But with that said, what I hope to do here is to sort of explore with you how cognitive behavioral therapy works, what it is, and how you can actually start to use it yourself, particularly in this time when there are a lot of hypothetical stresses in front of us in terms of the coronavirus and what it means for us as people and what it means in our day-to-day lives. So first of all, let's just look at it from a basic understanding. So when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, in essence, we're looking at our cognitions and our behaviors and understanding the ways that they influence our feelings, or actually the ways we do behave. So often what will happen in day-to-day life is we might have particular thoughts or feelings that are upsetting to us, and as a result of that we can act out in negative ways or have negative reaction to those thoughts and feelings. The strange thing about the way the brain works is that often we can't necessarily control what it is that comes into our mind and what we think about. If I told you not to think of a white table, it's basically impossible to not think of the white table, because by acknowledging the white table and trying to not think about it, you're thinking about it, because that's the way that thoughts work. So with that in mind, you got to understand that it's very, very difficult, near impossible, to address a thought that's distressing to you by trying to not think about it, if that makes sense. So for example, someone who's struggling to sleep and has the thought that I need to sleep doesn't want to think about the fact that they're trying to sleep. But because they're trying to not think about it, of course they're going to think about it, because that's just the way that it works. Our brains sort of work on what we focus on, not on necessarily what we want to focus on. That's also why people tend to struggle sometimes with studying and focusing on a task, because unfortunately while we focus on the task for a bit, we can't control what our brain ends up focusing on. We can check in on it and we can try getting it back on track, which is sort of what mindfulness is about. But in essence, we aren't actually in control of how our thoughts behave and interact. What we are in control of is how we perceive those thoughts, so what weight and value we give to thoughts. So when we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, in essence what we're trying to do is identify negative thoughts that can lead to unwanted behaviors or unwanted feelings, and work out how they're impacting us and how instead we can approach the situation. So for example, one common one that people tend to have is this negative perception of themselves. So they might have thoughts that run through their head that say, I'm stupid, I am worthless, I can't do anything right. And so it's not necessarily that these are true. In fact, a lot of the times these people are actually quite good at what they do, quite valuable people within society. But what happens is they have events that trigger these sort of thoughts, and then their response to that is to be upset by the thoughts. So for example, if you were working at work and you made a mistake, what you would probably want to do is identify that we make mistakes, that it doesn't necessarily reflect your intellect or your value or who you are as a person. But unfortunately what tends to happen a lot of the times is that trigger opens up the upsetting thoughts of I suck, I'm worthless, I can't do anything right, and that makes us upset. And all of a sudden we have this cycle where we get upset by the idea of being those things. Now unfortunately, because of the value that our brain puts on things we tie in emotionally, it's these sort of impactful thoughts and feelings that actually really can stick with us. So what we need to begin to do is to unpack these thoughts and the value that they actually have, because the reality of the situation is it's not necessarily the thought that is the problem. It's how we address the thought and react to it. For example, in the same scenario, if you were to challenge those thoughts, if you were to make a mistake and you said to yourself, I'm worthless, I can't do anything right, but then you said, well, hang on, that's not necessarily true. I know I'm not worthless. I know that this thought is just a negative thought, but it doesn't necessarily hold the objective truth of my situation. What ends up happening hopefully in that scenario is that there's less emotional weight put on the negative thought. So while leaning a bit more towards cognitive therapy itself, I think what's a really important skill is the ability to identify a thought as just a thought and not an objective truth. Now let's apply this to coronavirus just because it's a bit more relevant to our current situation. You might think that, the world is doomed, the world's not going to get better because of coronavirus. We're all going to get it and we're all going to crash financially and health-wise. These are all possibilities. I mean, what we're doing here is not trying to say that thoughts are wrong all the time, because you know what? Often they do have some sort of basis of logic to them. But what we are trying to identify is that they're not objective realities. This is all hypothetical concepts in the future. And what is very apparent is that focusing on them and giving weight to them doesn't do us any good, because we don't know what the future holds and we don't know how relevant that thought is. What we can probably identify is that when we think of that, we get upset, it makes us feel bad, and it makes us anxious. And then what can actually happen is we can begin to make a cycle. So, for example, we might get upset by the thought of what coronavirus might mean for our future. And it might mean that we act out in particular ways to give ourselves a bit of comfort. Maybe we lash out at people, we cry, maybe we get angry, maybe we have panic attacks. And what you can actually see happening here is a cycle. So you have your negative thought, negative concept, your value you put on that emotionally, and the response you give yourself to alleviate that emotional distress. Unfortunately, this doesn't address the actual thought. What you're instead doing is giving yourself a temporary alleviation to an overarching issue. So what you actually need to start to do instead is to stop giving the emotional weight to those thoughts. And that's sort of what we can begin to do by ourselves. So the way we do this is to acknowledge that a thought is there, but not try and challenge it or try and give it much emotional weight. So if, for example, the thoughts of coronavirus go into your head, you just need to be able to say to yourself that these are just thoughts. They're not the objective truth. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that there's no value in me worrying about it. There's no value in me challenging it. Sometimes in life there are things that we want the answers to because that's our nature, but we don't get the answers to them. What is there in the afterlife? What is the meaning of life? What is the moral decision in this situation? There's not always an objective truth. In fact, often there's never an objective truth, because depending on who you are and what your opinion is, the truth is different. So obsessing about an answer that you can't achieve can make it harder to get over these obsessive thoughts. The ability that we have to acknowledge a thought and just let it be and then move past it is so valuable in a time like this, but invaluable in general too. So one of the techniques I like to use is picturing myself at the bottom of an ocean and all my thoughts as waves above my head. So the way that this sort of works is that a thought can come over the top and pass beyond me, right? So it's a flowing system, much like our consciousness is flowing. So the reason that I have that visual trigger is because it separates me from the thoughts, because that's something we need to be able to do, is to be able to identify that we aren't the thoughts. The thoughts are just thoughts. They aren't actual realities, right? So I can let a thought come in. Okay, that's a negative thought, but I don't need to react to it. It can just come in and come out. And much like the table that I was talking about before, it's a lot easier to not think about it when you stop caring about it. So you probably haven't thought about the table for 10 minutes because it has no relevance to you. It's really hard to not think about it now because we're trying to not think about it again. But when we don't care about something, when it doesn't have emotional weight to us, it doesn't come up much in our thoughts, right? And so the quicker that you can get less emotional attachment to negative thoughts, the sooner that it'll likely just not come up much. Or when it does come up, it's not really that distressing to you, it's just a thought. In fact, often you might think about times in the past when you've obsessed about something and it might have zero impact on you now, you know? When you were 15, maybe you were obsessed about what people thought about your weight, for example. And maybe now you look back and you think, well, what was the big deal? Like, who cares? Like, maybe don't care what people think of your weight now. And so you can sort of see that the same concept that was so crushing to you as a teenager is so irrelevant now. And that's sort of the idea here, right? Is it's not the thoughts, it's the way we react to those thoughts. So this was just sort of like an idea about cognitive behavioral therapy, how you can maybe start to think about the way that your thoughts are impacting the way you feel and the way you behave. Again, if you are having really crushing thoughts and any symptoms related with depression and anxiety that you are finding really hard to deal with, it's really important to go see somebody. So hopefully this has been of some help. If you didn't see my first video that I've uploaded, which is basically a list of things that I recommend you start to do day to day while we're in isolation to help get a bit more stability in your life, it should just be attached below. I'll probably put it in the comments. But basically what's important here is to appreciate the rare situation we find ourselves in and make sure that we're on top of our mental health hygiene, because it's really easy for our mental health to deteriorate with such drastic change. Feel free to comment below if you have any questions, if you want anything else for me to address or sort of clarify. I'm probably going to keep doing things like this because I do think it's a really important thing that might be a bit overlooked at the moment. I think physical health is very, very important, but so is mental health. And in times of crisis, it can often be neglected. So, that's all for today. Thank you.